Is a support march worth bringing in the open field, or are you better off with all damage marches? Many of you were asking this as I was fighting in the open field in this KVK, and I was using a Trajan with Mulan in addition to 4 very high damage, high utility marches. So Cortex and I set out to do some testing to prove, at least to start to prove, not definitively, I won't claim to call it that, but to get some data showing, are you better off bringing a support, or are you better off just bringing all damage? And before I jump into the results, which I will do in just a second, allow me to thank the sponsor of this video, Infinite Galaxy. Infinite Galaxy is like Rise of Kingdoms, but in space, where you collect flagships and warships, and they even just released a brand new game mode called Ace Strike, where you are controlling a fighter from a third-person view, and you're crushing other warships. I mean, this reminds me a lot of, like, you know, a mobile game version of Wing Commander, but this actually pulls from the stuff that you've accumulated in the game, which is really awesome. And if you want to join us in Infinite Galaxy, then use the link in the description, which will support the channel, and join us in Nebula 13. Nebula 13 is where this is all going down. I have been playing this game for almost a year now, and I'm still very much enjoying it. So join us in Nebula 13. What are you waiting for? You may recall in my previous video that we proved that one of the best support marches you could bring, if you're bringing Trajan, is going to be Trajan with Mulan. This is for your typical open field brawls. A atypical open field brawl, a non-typical open field brawl, would actually be an Ark of Osiris mid-fight. And the best Ark of Osiris League teams are bringing Trajan with Aethelflaed. So I gotta mention at the start of this video, there's definitely use for these support marches, and they're getting a ton of play in Ark of Osiris and a mid-brawl. And without getting into why it is, that context is very different. I mean, there's like endless marches you can hit with AoE and buffs and so on, right? It's a different situation than your typical open field. What I want to get into is that more common situation in your KVK. Bring a support march or not. And at the start of this video, I'll say that there's something very important about a support march, which is that if you're free to play or low spend, guess what? The utility that you're going to deliver from a buff or debuff march is actually identical to what a high power player can bring. The fact that I've got really sick equipment, with the exception of maybe some of these accessories, which also bring more debuffs, the overall functionality of the commander is actually going to be the same. There is a little bit of damage factor, which will get some small amount of benefit from my tech, but otherwise, the amount of health and defense and rage restoration and skill damage boosting that you would give from like a Trajan Mulan, or the debuffs you would apply from Aethelflaed, it's all the same, regardless of your level of spend. And sure, I might do a little bit more damage with an Aethelflaed secondary, but it's about the same when you compare to what a free-to-play player can bring. And in that regard, for those players, I think support marches are really powerful. But what if you actually had almost every commander at your disposal? Should you bring 5 high damage marches? So in this video, we did some testing, and I brought my typical open field murder ball. That includes Guan with Leo, Nebu with Isong. I brought XY with Nevsky in this case, because that's the sort of cavalry that I wanted to bring for this particular test. I brought Artemisia and Amanatori, and the Trajan with Mulan. But then we ran more tests in the open field, just battling last person standing, count up the number of troops remaining, and just see which has more troops left over at the end. And when I brought the damage combo, I took out the Trajan with Mulan, and I brought in Gilgamesh with Cyrus. And you may be wondering, why Gilgamesh with Cyrus? In fact, I put a poll out on my channel recently asking, hey, what march should I add to my murder ball? And this was the least popular option, but I actually think it's one of the stronger commander pairs I could bring. Why is that? Gilgamesh is going to reduce the health of the target by 30%. Keep in mind that debuffs like this, and Mulan also has a damage boost to the target. Also, Trajan has one of these. Things that debuff a target to make them weaker, to make them take more damage. Those sorts of debuffs scale infinitely with the number of people hitting the target. Whereas certain debuffs do not scale infinitely. For example, if we get a look at this debuff from Cyrus, this does not scale infinitely, with the number of people hitting it. It is a skill damage reduction to the target. The target will deal less skill damage. Well, that literally is the size of 1, doesn't scale. However, okay, this will scale infinitely on Cyrus, making them take additional damage factor. So all damage over time effects hitting the target get boosted. I'm mentioning this because certain commanders do not scale as well as others do. And Gilgamesh is one of those commanders that actually scales infinitely with the number of targets that are hitting the same thing that you're debuffing. So that's a part of the reason why I really like the Gilgamesh and Cyrus combo. And without getting into that too much, before I talk about the results and then show them to you, I do want to mention that I put out a poll to you all to see what you thought. And at the time that I'm recording this, and I'll put up a more recent result from when I'm editing it. But at the time I was recording this, about 25% of you thought that the all damage combo was the way to go. And 75% of you thought that instead a support march should be brought. In this case, I was bringing Trajan Mulan. Now, Cortex, on the other hand, brought the same marches he was bringing last time around. You'll see them at play. He's got some stuff like Honda with Tommy. He's got Guan and Leo, as you might expect. At one point, he has Alex and Harold, and in some other tests, we tested with Esong and Mehmed. We ran a bunch of different tests, but the ones I'm going to show you, he brings the same 5 commanders. I bring the same 5 commanders. We count what's left over. And then we swapped out the support march for the damage march. And when we did that, on average, I had about 77,000 troops remaining with my support march. And I had about 201,000 troops remaining across all my marches. So I'm adding up the grand total of troops left. I mean, I don't even have like a full march worth of troops left. I had 201,000 troops left when I went with the all damage option. That is to say that the all damage option actually outperformed the support option. I found that to be fairly surprising. And I want to point out for just a moment, again, that the best Ark of Osiris League teams seem to all be bringing a support march to the mid fight. And I think there's good reason for that. But let me just jump into the footage and we can look at what's happening and start to assess. Here is the first round of trials. This is when I'm bringing a support march. You know, it's funny, as we did this testing, we actually learned more about things other than bring a support march or not, than actually like which one is better, bringing a support march. One of the things that we learned is that the target order is going to matter very, very dramatically. Perhaps more important than bringing a high damage march or not was your target order. And we targeted, we discussed this. We thought that the Tamaris was the biggest threat, making me take a ton more skill damage. But what we actually found is that the XY is a bigger threat by a long shot. So later on, we went and did some tests after this and sort of came to the conclusion that XY is so strong that basically anything else on the field doesn't matter. You have to remove the XY. The speed with which you can take out that march and the amount of damage it can do if you don't is so catastrophic that it's just gotta freaking go. So I'm mentioning that at the start as perhaps one of the more important conclusions. But what you're watching now is what happens when I've got these support marches. One support march here along with 4 high damage marches. And you will also notice, if you watch my other video about what secondary should you use for your support march, is it Mulan or Aethelflaed as a secondary to Trajan, or is it even Harold? These results are actually going to be a good bit worse than the testing I did in that video. And a part of the reason for that is that Cortex switched up his combo. He's now got Alex Harold instead of using Esong and Mehmed, which also, by the way, I found it fairly surprising that the utility from Alex and Harold might actually exceed the value of the AoE. And I'm also mentioning this because I really want to highlight, this is so important, that this is not a perfect test environment. Almost never in a KVK are you going to fight like this. More often than not, you will be maneuvering and repositioning and saving your rage bar to then unload full rage on a nearby target and do a lot of AoE. So there's actually a lot of value you can get, which you will not get here, from area of effect damage commanders, especially like, man, you catch somebody running around a mountain, you can angle all your AoE in a way that's just nasty. There's a lot you can do that's just fully not represented in this situation. So again, I want to mention the imperfect nature of this testing, but also that we ran 3 trials of each. So this is trial number 2, where I'm using support marches. And the other thing that you will notice, well, at least I noticed this pretty easily because I'm looking at the edits now, is that the fight lasts a lot longer when I'm using a support march. This, of course, makes sense, right? By using a support march, I am doing less damage, but I am also making whatever you're hitting take less damage too. And I guess it's maybe it is a little counterintuitive. Like the Mulan and Trajan also make the target take more damage, but they don't do a lot of damage factor themselves. So for that reason, I think the fight runs a lot longer. And in KVK, I mean, there is just a huge amount of value to closing out fights very quickly. The other big advantage, by the way, of Mulan that you get and you will notice in KVK that you do not see here because we're not marching anywhere is that march speed from Mulan. So I wanted to mention just like all this stuff, but you can see, I mean, this came down to like just one march duking it out in the end. This is a full gear test, and my gear is superior to Cortex's. He's missing, I think, 5 or 6 accessories, and some of his accessories were march speed. And I'm not doing that. I'm not saying that to like razz, Cortex or whatever. I'm just saying the fact that he's doing this well is pretty telling and is maybe topic for a separate video about what should or shouldn't be in a murder ball. But again, this is really imperfect testing where you battle to the death. And in this instance, I'm actually down to 1 march. But what's more surprising is that in this next battle, I actually am going to have 0 marches left over at the end. Spoiler alert, I'm not going to win. So this was the only situation against Cortex where I even, I think, lost, was when I brought a support march. There's a number of reasons why that could unfold this way, but it's definitely worth pointing it out. And here you can see, boom, we knock out each other's first marches, move on to the second march, but he just does so much damage to my archers. Like Neb Esong just freaking explodes, man. And this is really problematic for me. The sort of damage that my other marches are dealing is not keeping up with the damage that Neb Esong could have dealt. It's just 2 glass cannon. And so it gets completely knocked out. I mean, there could be an argument here that I should be looking for a more defensive configuration with the Esong or with the Nebu, and that might get a better result. But you can see, like, I'm in trouble now. I'm actually in, like, big trouble here. He's got 3 marches. I'm down to 2. I think that in an open field brawl where you can control a little bit more where your area of effect damage is going, that the Amonitory and Artemisia plays really well. But in a tight skirmish like this, where you probably just want a lot of debuffs because you actually will ride a target until it's gone, those debuffs have a lot of value. And I want to emphasize for a moment that those debuffs also lose a lot of value in the open field if you switch targets a lot. In that instance, buffing your own marches actually is very, very powerful, which is what Trajan is doing, which is what Mulan is doing. Also, they've got debuffs, but this result I actually found to be like really, actually almost disturbing when I was like, wait a minute, bro. Like, am I using the wrong marches in the open field? Is his murder ball like outright just better than mine? I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think that open field fighting is very different than this. But, I mean, I used a support march, and in one of the rounds of the support march, he actually gets a win here, which is, I think, a pretty big deal. So as soon as he finishes off this support march, we're going to switch gears, and now I'm going to bring the Gilgamesh with Cyrus. Okay, the Trajan is really tanky. He actually is shockingly tanky. And I will say, if you bring Trajan Mulan and the enemy targets it, man, GG. You get a lot of value. I think I've already emphasized this enough, but perhaps more important than what marches you bring is your kill order. And we actually did some testing that Maybe I'll make a separate video. Maybe I'll show it later. But we found that, especially if you're bringing a support march, if you target the wrong thing, it is very, very punishing and you do dramatically worse. And I think it makes sense. Like, if they're targeting most optimally and you are not, like, you're going to be in trouble. Here you can see we have to readjust a little bit. A little bit of walk time there is no good. But this is a part of the imperfect nature of the test, is that when you switch targets, things kind of relocate. And when they relocate, certain things end up in AoE and others do not. Here I was kind of worried I would lose again. I'm down to 3 marches and he has 4. But the thing is that, dude, my marches were a lot higher health than his. And so here's where I'm going to do a good bit of damage. Do I win this one? Or do I lose this one? Man, this is not looking good. I don't know how I pull out a victory here. I think this is maybe a targeting error. I think that targeting that Leo as soon as he did was really problematic, because Leo is just so tanky. This is why I really like Leo. It's just going to stall out the fight for so long that my other marches did a lot of damage. Yeah, I am going to pull out a win here. I was not expecting that I would. I actually, as I was rewatching this, I was like, man, I in my notes, I have a victory for this round. It sure doesn't look like I'm going to be victorious, but I was. You'll see. So in just a moment, I will be. And the reason that I target his Harold and Alex last is that the counterattack damage is something I'm just trying to avoid. Maybe I should have targeted it sooner. It's possible. Here I'm down to 1 march. I'm down to 1 freaking march, but it's got a lot of health. The Gilgamesh Cyrus did a lot of damage in this fight. A deceptively large amount. And then, boom, this fight's about to finish out. We'll run this again and get a look. So I've got some thinking to do as well on kind of like what I want to bring to these murder balls. I think that I'll spoil a little bit. We did some additional testing after we wrapped all this up. And one of the things we tested was Cortex using, instead of Alex and Harold, the E-Song with Mehmed. And I was just really surprised that the Alex debuffs were so good that it did better than just the raw damage of E-Song and Mehmed. I really think that has a lot to do with the nature of this fight. Like, when you're going to actually get full value from debuffs because you're just running onto a target until it's completely gone, I think those debuffs are maybe exaggerated in terms of the value you get from them. Call me crazy. Maybe that's crazy. Here, this is going to be another close fight. We tried to stick to basically the same kill order we had when I had the support march. Now that I watch the footage, I kind of wonder if we shouldn't have maybe just, instead of keeping the same kill order, but putting like Cyrus and Gilgamesh at the end, maybe that should have been targeted sooner. Maybe. But Gilgamesh and Cyrus are surprisingly tanky. Gilgamesh reduces normal attack damage taken by 15%. Also, Cyrus has reactive damage that has done literally nothing all fight because it hasn't been targeted. So as soon as the Gilgamesh and Cyrus starts getting targeted, it'll start doing reactive damage. It's AoE damage too. And it's damage over time. It's pretty nasty. So this fight's going to be pretty close. I'm going to end this fight with about 75,000 troops remaining in total, which is a very low number. And here's the 1v1. And this 1v1, I think, is very much designed for Cyrus to win. It's an ideal march to be in this situation. It's archers into infantry, which already is very strong. But, I mean, he barely gets any damage off on me, which is fairly remarkable. For the remainder of this 1v1 situation, pretty rough. Here's the final fight. And this final fight that I'm about to show, this is like, it goes really, really well for the damage march. And I think that maybe I just get a lucky proc at the start. See if you can figure out like what happened here, that this was just so insane. Boom, I popped his march like almost immediately. Now I swing around with the Gilgamesh, and that's doing work. I'm working on his XY. That's the second thing. I think maybe a part of what happened, did you see he just needed to relocate there? he had to spend some amount of time walking to get to the target he wanted to hit, and that was just a disaster for him. I think there's some really important lessons here, maybe beyond just like bring a support march or not. That just, if I had to summarize what those are, I would say it's target the right thing and pick targets of opportunity rather than having to take walks. Maybe that's the takeaway. Look at this. The number of troops I have left over here is insane. By the way, this left us with like a really important question. We wanted to understand like, hey, wait a minute. If we actually change up the kill order, how different is the result going to be? And it's actually pretty dramatic. So now we go and we target the XY first. I wasn't sure if I would show this footage or not, but let's show it. So when we target the XY first, you can see this is already going a little bit better, but the final result is actually going to be a lot better. This is when I am bringing, let's see here. Do I have Gilgamesh? Yes, I do. So I'm bringing a damage march here. And for what it's worth, the result got better by a higher amount when I actually was using a support march. So I think that because you have just less damage running around, it's even more important that you're picking the right targets if one of your marches is just there to support. It sort of, I think, exaggerates the effectiveness of your other marches. I mean, that's what you would expect, right? So it also exaggerates the error of making a targeting mistake because you really need to hit the right thing. So here we go. We're working down the Leo. I mean, I've got 3 marches left. This is a victory that looked a lot more similar to what we were looking at last week when we were doing these duels. And then both of these marches, I think, pop at like the exact same time from AoE. I actually killed his Herald Alex entirely from AoE. Okay, last test I want to show you. I bring back the support march. This time, by the way, in that last test, I had about 245, maybe 246,000 troops total remaining. In this test, I'm going to have 312,000 troops remaining. So I did just dramatically better with the support march when I'm targeting the right thing. I mean, it's unsurprising that that would be the outcome. And I don't know. I mean, maybe that amount you could just call margin of error. Maybe. But I just think that you're a lot more sensitive when you're using the support march to getting the right marches killed first. Because if you don't, and then you start losing DPS marches, your ratio of support to DPS changes kind of dramatically, right? Like once you're down to 2 damage in one support march, you're actually really losing a lot of the effectiveness that you were getting from a support march. That's my theory anyways. So in just a moment, this thing's going to wrap up. And it might not look like much right now, but these 3 marches have a pretty reasonable number of troops left. I mean, I'm going to end this fight with 3 solidly yellow marches, which is a lot better than how those initial fights were going, where, I mean, I even lost one of them. So, takeaways from this video. Let's jump into what those are. Takeaway number 1. If you're bringing a Trajan or any support march, make sure that you actually, with your few DPS marches, target the right thing. XY is almost certainly the top priority. Takeaway number 2. If you need to reposition a lot to hit something, you're probably better off just hitting the target of opportunity. The damage you lose by repositioning is actually catastrophic, especially because the enemy is losing no damage per second, and you are losing damage per second by virtue of repositioning, assuming you're in one of these tough fights. And then takeaway number 3 is that I think if you have the right damage marches, you might actually get a better result by using all damage marches. Does this mean that I'm going to take Trajan out of my rotation? Absolutely not. I really like the march speed from Trajan Mulan. You can't get away from me. You can't get away from me if I am chasing you down and I'm getting 30% march speed, especially with Crystal Attack. But even without it, like, you're not running away successfully. And that is also really valuable. Also, I can just walk away from a combat whenever I want, especially if I pay attention to when I skill cycle with Mulan and then run. I'm gone. You can't catch me with a 30% march speed boost. That's literally like charge talents. However, if I were doing this KVK over again and I already have my Cyrus and Gilgamesh expertise. I mean, I could have done that. I could have put sculptures into Cyrus sooner. I think I would certainly have tried using the 5 damage March route and just seen how I liked it. And I could have done that with Alex Herald, and maybe I'll play around with that a little bit and just see how I like it. I generally am inclined to perhaps overweight the March speed, but I don't know. My final takeaway for you will be this. Although these results, I would say, are not conclusive, like sample size is way too small to say definitively one way or another which is actually the best, I will point out that you will find in pretty much all the Arc League matches, and be on the lookout for this, right? You're going to see Aethelflaed primary and Trajan secondary all over the place. And I think the reason that you're seeing that is that the Aethelflaed debuffs and also the Aethelflaed damage is so good that when you see a bunch of enemies all stacked up like that, it's just totally OP to be hitting 5 targets and doing all those debuffs. And by the way, all those targets are then going to get hit by AoE skill damage from other players too. So if what you care about is Arc of Osiris, it does seem that Trajan is a part of what's going on there. And maybe some Ethel with Honda, maybe. But so few people have Honda, and like everybody's got access to Ethel, right? I think that even, for example, Ethel Joan of Arc, at some level of play, I'm not talking like the upper end of Arc League, I'm saying like at some level of play, having those marches I think is really great. And I mean, I would probably, if you're wondering, like, do I continue to use those? I would say for most players in the early game, almost certainly the answer is yes. Once you get to the late game, if you're free to play or low spend, I would still say like those are good commanders to be bringing, especially if you can keep them safe. But once you're deep into the season of Conquest, especially if you join a large kingdom, you probably need to be a little bit more choosy about which marches you bring because, man, like Aethelflaed primary is just like a magnet for getting exploded in KVK. Hopefully you found this video helpful. If you did, throw a like on here, consider subscribing. And until next time, you have fun smashing your enemies. And if you want to see the testing showcasing why it is I think Mulan is so strong, card will be up in the top and you can check that out.